This pair of tweezers seems to work best for me, because that means I can grab this piece firmly, and these curved jaw tweezers. Just going to give that a wipe of molybdenum paste through the pivot point there, and this fits over this post. Has to latch under this flash contact up here, this little contact or something. There's a bit of a wriggle to get it in. Fortunately my fingers know what to do, because you can't see what you're doing when you're putting it in place. That is not any different from the Retina 3C type shutters. Here's the moving flash contact that sits on top of that. The cover plate, I'll cock this action, that'll bring that contact round a bit out of the way. Now the cover plate. This is different than you'd see on a Retina 3C camera. You've got this little extra arm right here. That should be sitting much like that. Put that in place. Okay, so that little tab is sticking out. If it's tucked underneath, things won't go well. There's a fixed screw at this end. A return spring and a shoulder screw at the other end. The return spring goes on there like that. The shoulder screw goes in there, and the spring has to be free to move around the shoulder. Don't get it trapped underneath the shoulder. Check that that's free to move, that looks good. Tighten that screw. That spring hooks behind this arm. There's a little notch in the back of that arm, and the spring hooks behind that. You'll lift that up and over and hook it into that notch. So now that piece is sprung loaded. That's the latch that holds the main cam in the cocked position. Just check those two screws are tight, and I can fit the shutter release in place. The shutter release is here. I'm just going to give it a wipe of molybdenum paste on that hook there. A wipe on the shaft won't hurt. And this goes in right here. It has to be hooked in. This must be underneath the B lever. It has to lift the B lever when it's in its rest position. The spring isn't tucked in against the case like it would be on a 3C. It goes all the way around the inside of this piece. Otherwise there won't be sufficient return tension here. That's how that goes. The main cam can go back in place now on the shutter. It's here. Now I've cleaned all these parts. On the main cam I'm lubricating this with some molybdenum paste, and the main thing here probably to get is that curved surface. That's where it runs against the arm on the retard gear train, and if that's not lubricated with something, it'll gall. It'll rub up very hard. It's under a lot of spring tension. It'll rub up very hard against the arm on the the retard gear train, and it'll make the cocking action much stiffer than it otherwise would be. And what that does, as it means that the shutter cocking rack is under much greater stress and it's likely to fail. I'm putting some molybdenum paste on the 2 contact points on the blade actuating ring where the cam will run. I'll run some down the edge of this lever here. And I'll put this main cam in position. Let's pull that back so I can get this arm in okay. That's it. And swing that round to the start position. Let's lift it and swing it. Yeah, that'll do. We've got the bracket that holds that in place, or holds the spring in place. And that's got the longer of those 3 screws through there. That's its rest position. Here's the spring. Now this spring's in very good condition. If we take this tab at being at 12 o'clock, that's the other tab's at about 2 o'clock. That's pretty much as they are when they're new. It means that very likely last time the shutter was serviced, someone replaced the spring. New springs are very thin on the ground, very hard to come by. I think I've got a few, but we don't need one today. If the springs are tired, which is commonly the case, it means that in the rest position there is very little tension on the spring. And what that means, what the effect of that is typically that your shutter speeds aren't ideal, particularly at the slow end of the scale. There's a transition point between the 15th of a second and the 8th of a second position. And if that spring is very tired, you will find that the 15th of a second speed is very inconsistent. It can be more like an 8th. Anyway, let's just see if this will run down. It certainly does. That's all looking very good, and I need my retard gear train and the self timer, which have been percolating away in the ultrasonic cleaner and naphtha and now need to be blown out, made sure they're clean and dry, and then I'll lubricate them with graphite powder. Right, I've just cocked this shutter. I've got the retard gear train here, and I'll put this in place. The screw at this end is the fixing screw at this end. You can think of it as the pivot screw. The retard gear train can be swung inwards for greater engagement or outwards for lesser engagement with the main cam. And greater engagement means it'll slow the shutter down, and lesser engagement means it'll speed the shutter up. We'll start at about there and see what we get. There's a pin on here. This is the pin that follows the action of the speed settings cam plate. Now that pin's been bent. You can bend that pin in an effort to change the effective position of this arm relative to the speed settings cam plate and therefore the shutter speeds. The way the pin's been bent, it's been bent back this way, and I'm concerned it might rub on the body of this thing. If it does rub on there, then it means that it won't be moving smoothly. So I'm going to straighten that pin up. I've got the hollow punch from a staking set here. I want one that fits just over that pin so that I can lever it up straight. That's too big. Let's try this one. Yeah, it's a snug fit. I just want to straighten that pin up so it's not rubbing on anything. It's been fairly severely bent. It's sort of bent in two directions. Yeah, I think that's good now. These punches are from a staking tool set for watch repair. If I can get them back in the right pockets, we'll be in good shape. That's better. Okay, so speed train's in place. The self timer can go in next. This has to go over the pin on the arm of this thing. And then I've got to get this seated in the body correctly. There's a screw at the other end that sits into a pocket on that mechanism plate. I'm just trying to get this positioned correctly. Of course, I've got this stretched out now. Okay, see what's happening there. Can't seem to get this thing seated. Oh, there we go. Hang on, let's get that arm over get that tab over the pin. That's it, that's seated correctly now. Sometimes these are more of a struggle than others, though why is one of those secrets of the universe that you'll never know. Okay. It runs down nicely. Okay, so that's all working well. I think that shutter's probably going to run a bit fast in that position, but we'll find out shortly. I'm just running some molybdenum paste on the pinion that runs through here. And this piece here, I want molybdenum paste on the inside edge of that where it runs around the lens tube, and around the outside edge where it catches on a couple of little items there. This has a return spring on it, of course, and the return spring, if I can get this thing turned around, hooks over the pin on the top of that post, that difficult thing to screw in that we had to deal with earlier. If I can get that spring, is not an ideal shape there by the looks of it. That's better, get that in there, get this stretched out. And the last tooth on this should hook over, the last tooth on that pinion should hook over the last tooth there. That is sitting correctly now. This shutter will still not work unless it's got this catch in place, and this catch holds the shutter in the cocked position. I'll get that over its post. And the speed settings cam plate, which allows us to set our shutter speeds, is here. So I want to run molybdenum paste around the inside edge. That feels rough. It is rough. That's not quite circular there. It's been bent. And it feels rough. It looks like it's been, I don't know how it got misshapen like that, but I don't want to use that one. I'll just go and find one for my parts. That's just not good. Okay, start again. I've found another one. So as I was doing before, I'll run some molybdenum paste around the inside edge where it runs around the lens tube, around the outside where it runs on sets the arm for the retard gear train. And it runs on the case, it rubs on the case at that point. This is where the detent will run, the shutter speed detent, and that pressure pushes on the case at that point. Let's get this in place. And that of course is held in with the retaining ring. And that should be a working shutter. I'll just cock this. Set the shutter speed. This should be an 1/8, but it's probably going to be fast. Oh, very fast. Okay. So I'm going to have to move the retard gear train in for greater engagement with the cam to slow the shutter up. Let's see if where's the tool for setting this? Right, I've got a tool for cocking this shutter. That'll swing the arm out of the way so that I can get to the setting screw here and change that. Back that screw off slightly. Swing the retard gear train in for greater engagement. Tighten the screw again. Set this to an 1/8 and see what we get. Now that was better. I suspect that was slightly fast, but that was far more credible than we had before. What's it like on 1 second? Yeah, that sounds credible, doesn't it? I can go away and test this. What's it like on a 15th? I think that's fast. I don't think it's very fast, but I think it's fast. I'm just going to slow that down a little bit more and go away and test it. I didn't really get any movement there. I think we might just about be at the end of the adjustment. On an 1/8. Okay, I'll go and test this on a shutter speed tester and find out what I've got. I think I'm at the end of my adjustment there, and it may well be that I want to adjust the position of that arm, that pin that was bent previously. I might want to adjust it myself in order to get that to give the proper speeds. But I won't know that until I've had checked this out. I suppose we could check and make sure that the self timer runs down nicely with everything in place. Hold that in, set the self timer. Release it, self timer's running down. Nice and smooth. Back once I've checked those speeds. Those speeds are good. So that is ready for reassembly to the front of the shutter really, or the lens mount. So here's the lens mount. We have this baffle that goes on the front. Doesn't go there, it goes here. There's the detent ball for the shutter speeds. I'm going to put a blob of molybdenum paste on there. You could put a blob of graphite grease or any other grease you like really. It's just there to hold it in place while I'm assembling things. There's this tiny pinion that couples to the aperture settings, that sits over that post. Got our shutter. I'm running some molybdenum paste on the little detents here. That's where it's got to click over the ball. And then this fits in here in one position. I'm going to cock that now to make sure that the gear couples, that little pinion couples to the gear okay. It's not, I can feel that. Something's not sitting right. Oh, I know what it is. Idiot. It's that pin sticking out the front here, that fouls things. Oh, the ball's now just slipped out of position. Where did that go? Oh, the ball not slipped out of position because we never put it there. That ball must sit on that arm. I've got to hang this case over the front here because that pin sticking out prevents this from sitting down flat on the surface otherwise. You think I'd remember this because I've been caught before, but that shaft sticking out the front's not a common feature. Now that's rocking on something. I'm not sure what. It seems okay. Let's get the fixing screws in place. There are 3 screws. It's also possible that that cover plate, the black cover plate, may not be correctly positioned. If that slides off to one side, which is common enough, then this won't pull up straight either. Right, so no, that's in square. That looks good. The shutter speed detent works nicely. We'll cock the shutter and fire it again. Make sure everything's coupled up correctly. That seems good. I can tighten those 3 screws up. Okay, so that's that. Just check everything. You can see the little pinion down here. You can probably see it when I cock the shutter. If you can see that little pinion move. Yeah, you can see it rotate. Okay, so there's the shutter. That's ready to go back on the front of the camera, which hasn't yet been prepared. I'll just clean this up, get rid of that glue and other rubbish off there, give this a wipe over with some naphtha, and we can put the shutter in. Well, I have this all clean again. That's all looking pretty good now, so I can start putting it back together. I'll start with putting the shutter release back in place. So I'll just give that a light wipe of molybdenum paste there. I'll run some through those slots too where the screws go. Now there's that return spring for that, which needs to go into position. Let's find that. And that sits just in that little pocket there. Now I've got to sort of wiggle this thing into place. Oh, and get that spring seated correctly. Like that, like that. That's good. Get that screw in place. And get the other shoulder screw in place. And check that that moves smoothly. No problems there, that's good. That's fine. The shutter. Well, here's our shutter. Now this one's missing a piece of insulation here. It had a piece of plastic stuck over that, but it wasn't particularly exciting looking. I'm just going to put a bit of heat shrink over that contact so there's not so much bare metal hanging out there. Well, that bit of heat shrink will certainly do the job for me. Now see if I can get the shutter back into here. This is the arm that operates the shutter release. I'll just put a touch of molybdenum paste on that so the action's smooth. I've got to get my flash contact back through there. That looks pretty good. Of course, I've got that post sticking out the bottom of the shutter, so that tends to make this thing not sit flat. I'm just looking at that. No, that looks fine. Right, well, I'll put the screws back in place.